morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us either in person or online today for this media briefing by Women and Men Against Child Abuse. I'm Joanne Joseph. I am a member of the South African media and I sit on the board of WMACA. Now, just to remind you, there is a chat function. There's a Q&A function available to you if you are joining us online. A little bit later on, we'll be having a Q&A, and so you are welcome to put your comments and your questions on that chat. And I'll do my best to get to as many of your questions as possible a bit later on. Now, the reason we've invited you here is to discuss an important extradition case which is taking rather a long time to conclude. Many of you in the media, including our colleagues from independent newspapers here in South Africa, the BBC, the Times, and several other media houses overseas, have already published the story of Iain Wares, the South African former school teacher who taught here at home and in the United Kingdom as a younger man, and now, as an 83-year-old, is facing multiple sexual abuse charges in Britain. The United Kingdom has asked that he be extradited there to face these charges in Scotland. But WMACA believes that the extradition process, which requires the Justice Minister to apply his mind in the case of this octogenarian suspect, is moving much too slowly, especially given Iain Wares' age. Cases of this nature have played out in the public domain before. In several instances, the magnitude and effect of numbers is staggering. In the case of a single offender who was young and caught early in the Parktown Boys case, the charges numbered just under 400. More recently, the ongoing organised ring with one offender and one organiser of abuse, Ackerman and Kennedy, revealed a raft of over 700 charges. This pattern suggests to us that the magnitude of such cases cannot be underestimated in the context of people who are accused of beginning their abuse when they're young, as Marshall and Marshall's research shows. They seem to leave a trail of destruction, of broken young lives, the trauma persisting well into adulthood, or sometimes resulting in young lives ending abruptly, like the examples of two young men from popular local boys' schools who died by suicide as a result of the abuse they bore. In light of this, WMACA's senior leadership is here to call for the following: an explanation from the Justice Ministry as to why the extradition case is taking this length of time to conclude. An expedited extradition process so that Wares' accusers may see justice served in his and their lifetimes. And finally, and this is important, to appeal to any South African students who may have had similar experiences to those reported by Wares' British students to come forward. In the next few minutes, you'll watch a short conversation in which Nikki Campbell, the renowned BBC journalist, speaks to Neil Douglas, who is one of Wares' accusers. I want you to take a look at this video, and that will set us on the journey of pondering upon what may have happened in the case of Iain Wares.
I'm Neil Douglas. I'm a flying instructor. I was born 60 years ago in Edinburgh and 50 years ago in the school year from September 1972 to June 1973. I was in the class of Mr. Iain Wares. He sexually and physically abused me every day right throughout the school year.
My name's Nikki Campbell. I am a journalist. 61 years ago, I was born. I was at the Edinburgh Academy from 1966 until 1978, and it was when I was in the middle school that I witnessed Iain Wares abusing a boy, and subsequently have found out from very many of my friends that they were also abused on multiple occasions by Mr. Wares.
What is in many ways so disturbing about this is that it happened to us at the time. We knew it was happening at the time. We spoke about it to each other at the time. He had a terrible reputation of being a sexual predator, which we described in what would be assigned now as homophobic terms that we used about him. He was also had a fearsome reputation as a sadist, somebody who was liable to psychotic rages.
Yes.
And I guess one of the things was, if you were being sexually abused, he was being nice to you.
Yes.
And he wasn't beating you up. So we spoke about it with each other, but we didn't speak about it to authority. And that's the thing about them, because it's shame, it's guilt, it's protecting our parents who were paying a lot of money for our education, and boy did we know it. And it's the fact that we're 9-10 years old, he was doing it and he was doing it to everybody so often if they were in his class. How could it be wrong?
There was nothing unusual about it. You would go up to the front of the class, you'd have your book, he'd mark your book, you'd have to hold the book on the desk, and then he would use his left hand, put it around your leg, pull you in, and then sexually abuse you right in front of the class. So there was nothing about it at the time that seemed wrong. It wasn't even noteworthy. And he was just an angry man, so he would fly into a rage at times. He just hit kids, he beat them. But then he would comfort you afterwards. Oh, it's all right. And then the hand would go into your shorts and play with you.
And it was, as you say, it was in plain sight.
It was in plain sight.
It was in the open. When I witnessed my friend being abused, he was just about as close as you are to me now, just a matter of feet. And it was in the changing room, and there was a lot of hubbub in the change room, and people were getting out of their rugby kit. It was, as I remember it, it was a cold, wet, dark Edinburgh January afternoon, and the steam was coming out of the shower, and he had his hands around a little boy who was my friend, who was giggling, and his hands went down.
Doesn't surprise me. That's Wales.
I want to hear about the impact of the abuse on you, because it's an impact on so many other people. And since this came to light, I wrote about this in a book, obliquely. Obviously, I didn't mention his name. I wrote about his abuse in a book I wrote about my adoption back in 2003. Subsequently, it was gnawing away at me so much, I went to the police, but the person I saw being abused didn't want to do anything about it, so we left that. But it's always been with me. But what I've found out, and which you can talk about in just a second, Neil, which is the heinous thing about this, is that this man we have established through friends to whom this happened, Neil being one of them, although we've just met each other recently, but Neil being one of them. This happened if you were in his class, this happened on a daily basis for a year, for 2 years. So if you actually tot it up, this man is genuinely one of the most, if not the most prolific paedophile in British criminal history. And the impact, we are talking about thousands of offences, 5 years at the Edinburgh Academy, 6 years at Fettes College, abusing up to half a class at a time in every class. We are talking about absolutely one of the most prolific paedophiles in British criminal history. And the impact he has had on so many lives is devastating, like your life.
The thing I find incredibly, it kind of hits me, is the impact that abuse has had on survivors. We all seem to exhibit the same range of symptoms. So crippling anxiety would be one of them. And by that I mean almost a restlessness and despair. A couple of weeks ago, I'd given my statement to the Scottish Child Abuse Inquiry, and I was bouncing off the walls at home. I was scratching, I was looking at a bottle of whiskey, thinking maybe I just need to down that to try and just dull the noise in my head. It just this, I couldn't find any release from the anxiety. And then you talk to other people and discover they live like that all the time. Self-doubt, complete inability to believe that I'm any good at anything. I learned not to be good at maths in Wales' class, because if you were good at maths, you marked your book quicker. So if you wanted to avoid the abuse, you tried not to, but then you just got beaten by him, so it didn't really work. But I'll do something well. People tell me I do something well, and I'll say, oh, thank you, that's really kind, that's great. And then I go home and I just lie awake. It was rubbish. I failed. I've got it wrong. The need for affirmation from any source. So many of the guys talk about just this desire for people to say nice things to them and to affirm them in some way. I don't trust other people's motives. Someone does something nice towards me, I'm thinking, what's the game in it for them? I don't have many friends. I've got 2 close friends. I'm 60, I've got 2 close friends. But then you start talking to the others who are survivors, and it's a common theme. No ability to make friends. The year after I was in Wales' class, I tried to hang myself. when it all came flooding back again in 2001.
How old were you when that happened?
I would have been 12 when I tried to hang myself, 11, 12, something like that.
So it was plaguing you?
It was plaguing me, yes.
Every day?
Every day. And then
what would have happened if you told your parents?
I didn't have the language to tell them. I knew there was something wrong, and I knew I hated it, but we hadn't had sex education by then. We didn't understand what was going on. It was just this man was doing stuff and beating us up. It was really, yeah. And then it came out into the public arena in 2001, something like that. One of the guys did an article in The Scotsman. That led to me sitting with a bottle of sleeping pills and counting them out. A friend phoned just at the right time and talked me out of it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. Hypervigilance, trying to make situations safe. We're sitting unnaturally close to each other so that these cameras will work for this press conference. I wouldn't get this close to another bloke normally.
Neither would I.
It's just feeling.
But we'll get through it.
We will get through it.
I hate touching and I hate being touched.
Yeah.
Apart from family.
And this is the thing about it. It's not that's my story, but it's the story of everyone I met.
I think the big thing is what you said there about the lack of trust in people's motives and the lack of self-esteem. And some of us deal with self-esteem differently from others. I mean, some of us go completely the other direction. Validation is something that I've craved, but validation has given me a laser-like focus and ambition.
It's going to help you with your career, but it's unhelpful in other contexts.
Completely.
I served as a minister in a church for 12, 15 years, and if you're looking for validation from the people that you're serving, it just doesn't work, so you have to bury all of that. But the natural bit is craving the attention. And the impacts are just enormous. It's like those root weeds where the roots go under the ground and they spread out for miles and miles and miles, and then little bits pop up, and you don't realise the connection until you start talking to other people like yourself, another survivor, and hear the same things coming out of their mouth, and you realise, crikey, I do that because of the abuse.
What I saw, that should not happen to any child, and no 9-year-old should have to see it happening.
No.
And so I'm driven by that. He's been lurking in our lives to a greater or lesser extent for 50 years, like a malign presence, because I remember the fear. I remember that stay away from him. He's a psychopath. We wouldn't have put it in those terms, but he's vicious. Weirdo wares. He's vicious. He'll hurt you, or he'll touch you. I remember that. So what happened to my friend over the years, thinking about it, trying to do something about it, not going through with it, and then thinking, oh, maybe it just happened to a few people because we didn't, people didn't say, did it happen to you? And 100 hands didn't go up. There was shame and there was guilt, as you said. And then finding out that this was on the agenda, it was being spoken about on a radio program. I heard it when I came home from work, and that's when my mission started. And that mission has been near to an obsession since I heard. And then when I found out there were more and more and more and more survivors, more than you can possibly get your head around, that's when this has become for me just such a momentous, egregious injustice. And I think we're all driven by a sense of justice, because what happened to you, what happened to your friends, what happened to me, what happened to so many of us was just unfair.
It should never have happened.
It should never have happened. And it was unfair, and something needs to be done. And this man is sitting in South Africa, in Cape Town, having a comfortable life. And he has done this to so many people, hundreds of boys, thousands of offences. And that is why we're all driven. Till our dying breath, we want the world to know how much harm this man did, how many offences he committed, and he is right up there when it comes to the most serious serial paedophile offenders in British criminal history. If he were to come back to Scotland to answer to his hundreds of crimes, his many, many, many offences, and
our dream, I think, is for him to appear in the High Court in the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, to have a trial there, a fair trial, and then for the right verdict. And I think if we were all to stand outside that courtroom after a guilty verdict, I think that would be a great day, wouldn't it?
It would be a fantastic day. He needs to answer for what he's done.
The other thing is that what we can't get our heads around, not only is he living in comfort in this retirement home after blighting so many lives, after abusing so many boys, because you kind of freeze in time. We're all little boys when we talk about this. We're 9 years old again. We're 10 years old again. What we just want people to realise that they are harbouring this prolific paedophile. We just want people in South Africa to know that he is there and he has done this and he's living in comfort. And I'm sure when people think about that, they will feel this should not be the case, and they will share our sense of injustice. It is a scandal.
Well, I know as a man of faith, I don't have faith, but I completely respect the fact that you do and you have belief. Ultimately, he will face a higher power. But before that happens, he must
face a power here
on this earth.
Yes,
in this time,
cannot be allowed to die in comfort.
First things first. For him to die in comfort in South Africa would break the hearts of many men who are already broken.
Yes. And the constant delay is just making it worse for people, because they've waited 50 years to speak and now they've spoken. And somehow this man is sitting in a retirement village in South Africa, a beautiful looking retirement village. He has escaped extradition. He was found liable to extradition in 2019. He escaped custody because of COVID. He is living in his comfortable home. He is still free. Why isn't he back in the UK answering for his crimes? There are plenty of 83-year-olds in prison in South Africa. There is no good reason for him not to be in prison at the moment, awaiting his appeal and awaiting extradition. Nicky, thank you.
Cheers, Neil. We're touching each other. This is a big thing.
Yes. Let's not hug.
A handshake's okay.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for that, Nicky Campbell and Neil Douglas. And you'll get a chance to actually join Neil Douglas a little bit later on for our Q&A, and you'll be able to put your questions to him. So we get a sense from that video of some of the very personal stories that emerge out of this Iain Ware's case. And as Nicky Campbell so rightly says there, it is so easy to forget with our fast-moving news agenda, both overseas and here. It is so easy for stories like this to be swallowed up in the news agenda. And that is part of the reason that we have held this media briefing today. It's to bring this back onto the news agenda, to remind fellow South Africans that in this country is a man accused of several charges of sexual abuse, who faces extradition to the United Kingdom, who is fighting it at the moment, and WMACA today putting out this call very strongly for this extradition to take place as soon as possible. Sitting next to me is Peter van Niekerk, and let me tell you who he is. He is the Evershed Sutherland Senior Partner, Head of Litigation, and he is a WMACA board member. Peter van Niekerk joins us on this panel to talk us through some of the basics around the legalities in this case. Peter.
Thanks, Joanne. So, as you probably would have heard, in August 2019, pursuant to a request from the United Kingdom authorities, the court found that Mr. Wares is liable to be extradited to the United Kingdom. It found that there was sufficient information to confirm that he had committed extraditable offences, and it ordered that Mr. Wares should be granted bail pending the Minister of Justice's decision regarding his surrender to the United Kingdom. It also authorised that Mr. Wares be surrendered to the authorities in the UK, obviously, when he gets there. As I say, that was in August 2019. The following month, in September 2019, Wares made various representations to the Minister of Justice opposing his extradition. In his representations, he makes numerous admissions of having sexually abused various young boys, and that's hardly surprising given what you just heard on the video beforehand. He goes into graphic detail in his representations, and I'm not entirely certain of all the facts because it hasn't been available, but as I understand it, the Minister of Justice must have authorised his extradition, and Wes has now appealed to the High Court in Cape Town against his extradition, and that matter has unfortunately been postponed until October of this year, which is no doubt extremely frustrating to all the people involved, as well as my colleagues at WMACA.
Thank you very much for that outline, Peter. Let me now introduce you to founder and founding member of WMACA and Senior Director Miranda Jordan. And Miranda is going to fill you in on why WMACA chose to focus on this case. She's going to bring you some of the latest updates, and she's going to talk about the context of historical abuse. And shortly after that, Mr. Luke Lamprecht, WMACA's advocacy manager, will then expand on the dynamics of grooming and the failures of the system, which often allow paedophiles to breed in learning institutions. Miranda?
Thank you, Jo. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today. I'd like to introduce you to a South African man who first abused boys more than 50 years ago and is currently fighting extradition to the UK on 84 charges brought by 42 men. His name is Iain Wes. He's 83 years old and he lives comfortably in a retirement village in Cape Town. My name is Miranda Jordan, and our advocacy wing has spent much of this year trying to expose Iain Wes, also known as South Africa's Jimmy Savile, dubbed so by 61-year-old Nikki Campbell, OBE and BBC presenter, who said, "Being in a changing room as a 10-year-old after a rugby match and seeing a teacher abuse my friend, I cannot describe it here, but I can never unsee it." This man, Iain Wes, was known to all of us as a predator and a sadist, but we never told anyone. My school friends and I talk about it with each other, and we talk about it with contempt, disbelief, and incomprehension that that sort of thing happened in plain sight and nothing was done. The fact is that his extradition is a public matter and of public interest, and so it is within that context that we are able to name him as Women and Men Against Child Abuse in South Africa. He has been widely covered in the British press and often on front pages of the UK Times, the Mirror, the BBC, the Scottish Sun, and the UK Daily Mail, but lives largely here in South Africa anonymously, and we would like that to end. Iain Wes is a brutal, sadistic man who abused scores of young boys between the ages of 9 and 11. He taught boys at 3 schools in Cape Town and 2 schools in Scotland. And he is, according to the UK survivors, one of the most prolific sex offenders in British history. So what's going on with Iain Wes today? He lives with his wife, as I said, comfortably in a retirement village in Scotland, in Cape Town, in South Africa. He used to teach at Western Province Preparatory School at St. George's, and then when he returned to South Africa at Rondebosch Preparatory School. But it's alleged decades of abuse. In fact, I should just say, it is his decades of abuse at the Edinburgh Academy and Fettes College that drew the attention of the Scottish police. They want him to go back to Scotland, and they want him to face the music. Iain Wears would not like to. He's fighting this extradition, as we've just heard from my fellow director, because he'd much rather spend the rest of his life in his home. Thank you very much. But what of the children he taught in South Africa? And hopefully this expose will open the door for further disclosures, both those in the UK and in South Africa. But while he tries to avoid extradition, his name, his face, and his horrific crimes must be in the open for everyone to take heed and to take care. I sincerely thank every journalist and media house in South Africa who have helped us, WMACA, over the decades to make these men household names in the worst possible way. These men do not deserve a peaceful retirement. They deserve hell on earth, the kind of hell which they condemned so many children to. But how do we know he did it? Firstly, because we believe the victims. We know that 42 men do not make up the same story and relive decades-old trauma just because they think a 7-year criminal justice process will be fun. But there's a second way we can be sure. Iain Wears admitted it. He admitted it in an affidavit that he likes touching boys, and in 1979, when a pupil complained at Fettes College, he admitted his behavior and agreed to leave. When Iain Wears admits that he had an urge to touch children inappropriately and on occasion did, that is a quote. It sounds barely invasive, doesn't it? What he did do was masturbate 9 and 10-year-old boys. He cupped their buttocks, he rubbed their anuses, and fondled their testicles. He left every single child with lifelong trauma. Some of these boys are now in their 60s, and all of them are still haunted by it. You may ask, why is childhood sexual abuse such a big deal? According to academics, the damage can be analyzed through 4 factors: traumatic sexualization, betrayal, powerlessness, and stigmatization. Betrayal and stigmatization are fairly self-explanatory, but I'd like to focus on traumatic sexualization and the powerlessness of the boys who were abused by Wears over the past half-century. Traumatic sexualization refers to the process whereby a child's sexual feelings and sexual attitudes are shaped in a way that's inappropriate to the child's developmental stage. It occurs through an adult giving the child affection, attention, privileges, and gifts in return for sexual acts. The child learns a horrible lesson, that they must use sexual behavior as a strategy for manipulating others, even as they try to satisfy their own developmental needs that an adult has ripped them of. Traumatic sexualization also refers when certain parts of a child's anatomy are given distorted importance and meaning. It occurs through the misconceptions and confusions about sexual behavior and morality that are transmitted to the child from the offender like Iain Wears. It occurs when terrifying memories and events become associated with the child's mind with sexual activity. For a survivor of abuse, it takes a lifetime to disentangle their sexuality from their trauma. And then there's powerlessness, or what may be called disempowerment. It's a process whereby the child's free will, the child's own desires, the child's own sense of self are continuously ignored so that the adult can take what they want from the child. This powerlessness is often referred when children fail in attempts to stop the abuse. It is increased when children are scared to tell adults what is going on because they may not be believed or may not be understood. Once a child's faith in authority is shaken, it can become impossible for them to accept any authority whatsoever. This makes it impossible very often to live a fulfilling life as a member of society. So thanks to members like Iain Wares, the effects of traumatic sexualization is combined with powerlessness, which gives you a recipe for a very difficult life. For decades, you won't know where to turn, because when you were a child, someone turned your body against you. This is the curse that haunts scores of boys for half a century now. And now he pleads he wants to be left alone. Well, we at Women and Men Against Child Abuse will ensure this will not happen and that we will get justice for the victims. You may ask once again why we are focusing as an organization of historical abuse, which was part of our mini Me Too campaign following the Me Too campaign a couple of years ago. Well, that's because we know that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and actually only really in the 2000s, did a language for abuse come about. There was no language before that. And it's only really because as an organization, we started exposing these men. And what is increasingly necessary, particularly for me, leading advocacy at this stage, is to expose those around them who protect them, carry on protecting them, because what these men do is literally leave carnage in their wake. It also appears that society still grapples when one of these men, accused of these crimes, appears to be an upstanding, well-known, wealthy, famous person or works in an environment that is held in high esteem, like a very good private boys' school, to see them as the hideous sexual predators of our children that they are. Some of those cases that WMACA along the years have worked with are the Bob Hewitt, Sidney Frankel, and the Catholic Church of South Africa. I need to say that these cases took us between 3 and 6 to 7 years. It takes a huge amount of human resource. It takes financial commitment from both the organization, the survivors, and the legal bodies that assist us pro bono here. To end off, I'd like to say that Iain Wares is a known child abuser, a sexual predator and paedophile. The UK government has formally requested that the South African Minister of Justice, Mr. Ronald Lamola, orders the extradition of Wares to stand trial on 84 counts of sexual abuse. In accordance with South Africa's extradition treaties with the UK, compliance is now a matter of international law. We ask Mr. Lamola to expedite this extradition. We cannot be harboring a wanted man. Thank you.
Right, good morning, everyone. You know, when WMACA looks at these cases, there's a second element that we always look at, which is the component of what can we learn from these cases and what do they teach us. And I mean, ultimately, we are trying to move from a world where we have a Me Too movement that requires people to come forward decades after being abused and change that hashtag to "it ends with me." So the main concept we want to land here is just to show the public and warn parents, institutions, and those who have duties of care for children about what they actually need to be looking out for and the fact that they do have a duty to act. So what themes has this brought up for us? Firstly, we need to understand, as Miranda has mentioned, that there are enormous disincentives to disclosure within the context of child sexual abuse. In the sort of historical cases, there wasn't even a language for it, which Miranda has alluded to. But we need to think about the context of the boy child in particular, particularly in total institutions such as things like boarding schools, the military, etc. And what happens within those institutions is that there's a level of hypermasculinity overlaid with massive sort of homophobia. And no matter what people say about sort of the progressive nature of the world, there is still a couching of one of the defenses of this kind of sort of heinous abuse of small boys by sex offenders, couched in this kind of defense of some kind of sexual preference. So you'll take, for example, the Ackerman-Kennedy case that we're dealing with currently. Mr. Ackerman will say things, oh yeah, no, but this is something that commonly happens within the male homosexual community. I strongly disagree, and I think the male homosexual community needs to stand up and say this is certainly not our people and how we behave. Sexual preference and sexual pathology are not the same thing at any level. And after all the gains that has been made within the LGBTIQIA+ community, how can we now be reduced to a place where people who use their power to harm children are somehow sort of accommodated within that? I mean, it's appalling. The second and very important concept, which is one of those double-edged swords, and there are many disincentives for males to disclose, but one of the big ones, besides the ones of, cowboys don't cry, and, how did they choose me, why didn't I fight back, all the usual sort of hyper-masculine stuff. The very important one is what we call the vampire myth. So within the male survivor sort of community, the vampire myth is that sort of saying that in order for us to understand why men behave like this, we have to come to some kind of reason so that we are not plagued by the frankly pure evil nature of their behavior and needing to believe that exists. We come with a concept where we say men who are abusers have been abused. Now, you must understand that has two very, very big implications. The first implication it has is the concept that we have to, in some way, feel sorry for the person who's abused children because they themselves were once victims. Now, all the literature we have around male survivors is that most of them are not offenders. And most of the offenders were not once abused sexually by other men. So the idea that somehow when you get abused, you become an abuser is called the vampire myth, and we really need to dispel that because the first thing it does is it creates a victim out of the offender, which I'll talk about at the end in the Ware's case in particular. But the other thing it does is it disincentivises other men from disclosing because suddenly you're not safe around children. So we really need to fight back quite strongly against those two. The next thing is that we need to recognize, for those of you who work with children or raising children, those of you who are parenting children in whatever capacity, even social parents, you need to understand that there are 4 preconditions for abuse to occur. The first is that there is a motive for the person who's abusing children to abuse children, and frankly, by Mr. Ware's own affidavit and his own admission, his motive was that he liked to do it because he had urges. Now, we mustn't go back to the vampire myth and find some strange kind of justification or strange kind of rationale for their behavior. They like having sex with boys. That's what they like. That is what their sexual urges are. So to couch it in any kind of justification undermines what they are doing. They like to have sex with boys. Okay. Now, within that context, we need to understand that they have to overcome their own internal inhibitors, because the internal inhibitor is the thing that says, well, you shouldn't do this because it's bad, it harms people, and you know, it's frankly, it's an evil thing to do. Now, obviously, Mr. Wares was able to completely overcome his internal inhibitors, and in fact, he went out and initially, when he started in South Africa, he recognized as these urges while working with boys. He had studied psychology, then went to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist sent him to another psychiatrist in Scotland because there was no programs in South Africa, and that Scottish institution set him free on boys, where he then completed his education to teach and then went on to teach. In that process of him teaching, he then went on and continued to abuse boys, and then went back to the same institution so that he could get treatment because the previous treatment hadn't worked. So he had a shorter additional program, and then was released to abuse boys again within the Scottish context. So we must understand that that's the third precondition, and that's the one that the public really needs to listen very carefully to. And that is the precondition where the offender needs to overcome the external inhibitors. And the external inhibitors are us. It's not the 10-year-old boys. The idea that you can teach children to say no to adults when trusted, powerful adults in total institutions are doing sadistic and harmful things to them is mythical. I mean, we do not even encourage our children to say no to us in safe contexts in the world, and now we want them to do them in unsafe contexts where they are completely beholden to and dominated by and harmed and hurt by the people who are meant to care for them. And the institutions institutionalize that. So we had an institution that released a man onto boys, institutions that kept the secret, and remember, the power of abuse is the secret, where the institution then be asked again to please help because he was a man that had abused young people, and he was sent back to another institution to continue to abuse children. Now, how does this work? So there was very recently, there was an American report released that was called, and I mean, I don't like the terminology, but it's what they used, I don't know, sort of maybe a bit of American kind of media sensationalism. But the concept was that the men who are harming the children in the school context are trash. So they would say that there is a case of moving the trash. So they would move them from one place to another. And then the idea with this report was that we want to clean out the trash. You know, what we are saying is that, you know, we want to take out the trash, if you talk about it in sort of a pure South African kind of scenario. And in order to do that, we have to make sure that the secret that is kept is actually is undone, because that secret, the institutional secret, the confidentiality of the medical fraternity and the mental health fraternity that protected him, all of that contributes to the power. And then finally, the fourth precondition is they need to overcome the resistance of the child. 10-year-old boys do not want to be touched and hurt by adult men. That's not what they want. Therefore, he, and Mr. Wares in particular, is a combination, as you saw in the interview, of this idea that I will be nice to you and I won't harm you as long as I'm touching you. So there's this interplay between violence and sexuality, which is extremely common within what is called the boarding school syndrome, which is a whole thing in the UK, where you have a situation where you have people in positions of power and they conflate sexuality and violence, and the violence is part of how the secret is kept in these scenarios. And then obviously the other one is grooming, which we all know is about favoritism, isolation. It's about the fact that there are taboo and boundary violations, and then the testing and the abuse of a child. But in this case, it was just so blatant that nobody cared. So at the expense of the children, men were protected to save the reputation of institutions and some potentially grandiose idea of the rehabilitation of this man by the mental health profession. So in conclusion, I just want to mention a few important things. Number one, the affidavits mentioned by all of my colleagues on the panel, They are admissions. Now, in the second set of admissions or things said, you must remember an admission is he says they happened. He doesn't say he's guilty of anything. In fact, the second one is he's not guilty of stuff because the crimes are not the same. There's some sort of gibberish legal argument that I don't understand, Peter can talk to. But the point of it is that if you make a confession, you show remorse, and your guilt is shown by the fact that you will take the consequences of your behavior. So now let's go back to my mentioning of the idea that we create victims out of offenders. And here we have a man who is claiming because of his age, his marital status, his children, and his family that he is being victimized by these men and the system who wants to send him back, and it's not in the interest of justice for him to be sent back to where he committed the crimes. Whose justice is the question? And it is certainly not the justice of the victims. The concept in the law of innocent until proven guilty, we must understand, has a very, very big implication for victims, because it means in a criminal justice system where there's a concept of the fact that someone's innocent until proven guilty and beyond a reasonable doubt, the idea is that the victim is lying until the court can prove otherwise, beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, I know that's not what the law says, but if you listen to how Neil and Nikki spoke, the idea that their voices have not been heard, I think the quote by Nikki directly is, "This process breaks the heart of already broken men." My plea to the victims is, do not let these men retain power over you for the rest of your lives. There is something about the fact that they believe they have power over you that gives them some kind of strange sadistic satisfaction, and you need to take the power back. So what can we as a country do? We need to send a very strong message that if you want to show remorse, not regret, and you want to use your age and your family as a shield, go face the charges. Go face what you have done. You are not sorry. You're just sorry you've been outed. You request compassion for you and your family, but you show these victims and their families none. And you betrayed them all, and your family are the victims of your actions as well. Creating noise is what these offenders do. That he's been victimized is making his victims invisible and silencing them. This must stop. The South African government must show good faith and say, if there are people like this here, we need to send them to face justice. Thank you.
Luke, thank you very much for that. All right, so if we have any questions at this point, I'm happy to take them. I'm not sure if we have any questions in the room or any questions online. Do we have a question? Yes, we do. We are going to just get a roving mic to you, and we'll give you a second to hear the gentleman with the scarf on. Yeah, thank you.
Good morning. Norman Kluti, the news editor at the Saturday Star. My question is for Peter. In terms of the Department of Justice, I mean, they may not tell us the reason behind the delay, but what do you have contacts in the UK? Because I'm assuming South Africa would have given the UK reasons for the delay. Do you know anything about that?
I don't. A lot of apologies. I don't, and unfortunately, a lot of what has transpired has been from me being able to get records from the courts, etc., which hasn't been as easy as I would have liked it to have been. I can only assume that the minister has held that he should be extradited. And I say I assume that because otherwise why would he be appealing to the Cape High Court? And so I would imagine that the South African authorities would have simply advised the UK authorities that they've approved the extradition. They can do no more in the sense that their decision has been challenged in the High Court. And to be fair, I suppose, to the authorities, there's not a lot more they can do now because it's out of their hands. And as I mentioned, it's now been postponed for a couple of months, which is very frustrating for everyone involved. I hope that helps, but...
Well, I mean, I'll ask the Minister of Justice, or his spokesperson at least. Peter, one last question for you. Have you seen papers that can confirm that Iain Wes is indeed fit to stand trial, he's of sound mind, etc.?
I've seen sufficient papers to say that, because certainly in his representations, where he confirms and confesses having abused children, etc., his defences are, one, technical, highly technical. I don't know how one could argue that what he's done in any jurisdiction is not sexual abuse. And the second thing is I think he admits that he's alive and well, and that why should he be prosecuted now that nothing has happened for so long? And as has been mentioned, he's happily living with his wife, and how unfair would it be for him to be extradited? Is effectively his refrain. So there's been no question of, I'm not able to stand trial on any other basis, and that's certainly not, as I say, it's highly technical, his grounds for opposing the extradition.
Thank you.
Thank you, Norman.
Sorry, I've got a question for Luke and Miranda. Just a quick one. What would you say to, now that this case is getting quite a bit of traction abroad and locally, and I'm reading a few articles where general members of the public who have never in their life been affected by abuse are coming out and saying, almost shame he's old, let it go. What would your message in particular be to those people out there? Because I think it's important for the victims that haven't come forward yet, to give them some reassurance that not everyone's against you. So if you can answer that, thank you.
I think, Kev, that, historical child sexual abuse is something which really has come to the fore in the last 10 years. I mean, in the sense of, yes, probably asking me that question 15 years ago, would have been... it would have been a lot more difficult. But we have seen the growing understanding by the public when they have seen that men, as I've said, like Bob Hewitt, like Sidney Frankel, these are hugely powerful men, and if we can get those men to answer to the crimes they've done and to really receive widespread media coverage, both in South Africa and internationally, and see somebody removed from the International Hall of Fame because of his abuse and condemned internationally, not only in South Africa, and then somebody who's a businessman, a renowned billionaire, and at that time a so-called philanthropist, really eventually, when he did pass away, being called what he was, and that's first a paedophile and then a billionaire businessman. So I think it gives people courage to come forward when they see that. I think the fact that with the team over here, an institution like the South African Catholic Church, not only to get an admission from them, but also for them to compensate the victim. And when we look at the braveness of William Segedisho when we brought that court to stand up to a man at that stage who was also moved around, very much like now, but also a successful case, another successful case. And then we have others. We had a Salvation Army captain and many others who were not high profile, but people have had successes in bringing those perpetrators, encourage them. And very importantly, and I know, Luke, you will probably pick that up from me now, was the fact that we changed law in South Africa. We are really up there when it comes to our constitutional court. And the fact that we had the prescription of 20 years. So yes, rape never expired, murder never expired, and kidnapping were the three crimes that would automatically, you could come 50, 60, 70 years later and you could still bring the case to court. But with the Frankel case, that was brought, it was overturned, and a child, from being all the descriptions of what I described of the way these children were touched sexually, then also allowed a case of 50 years later to come through. And we know we've worked regularly now on 30, 40, and 50 years. So that's my answer, Luke.
Okay, I just have two things to add. The idea that someone is old absolves them of what they did is, for me, one of the most bizarre arguments ever. Because the big thing is the phrase dirty old man is there for a reason. People don't get better because they get older. Okay. And in fact, on the contrary, this man allegedly sought help multiple times without any success. So that, I think, might be the second part of my answer. What do we learn from these cases? So I know victims want a concept of justice, whatever that may be. Now, it may be that justice looks like a conviction for some people, but when adult survivors come to me, the thing I say to them is, what do you want to achieve? What's the motive for coming forward? They will say to me things like, I want to protect others, I'm worried that this person might have harmed other people, I want to give other people a chance to come forward, I want to change law, I want just to make my voice heard, etc. So I think for any adult survivor to understand why am I coming forward is an important concept, because I think that to rely on the criminal justice system is the only way to think that justice has been served. It is not even served in current cases, let alone historical cases. So what we must understand is that there are many potential outcomes, because ultimately it's your story as the victim, and the most important thing to understand is that the power of abuse is the secret, and by breaking it you change the dynamic.
Thank you, Luke.
Thank you very much for that, Luke. And we've had a question from Rorisang, Rorisang Khosana from Times Live. Rorisang, thank you for this question. She says, quick question. I read that Wares appeared in court on the 6th of June this year. What was that appearance about? Was it related to his appeal?
Okay, so no, it's not related to his appeal, but anything that may be happening currently in South Africa, this conference is about this international extradition and about the UK victims, we will be able to comment at a later stage. After he's pleaded. But at this stage, we cannot comment, and that it would be in contempt of court. So we can't comment on that. We hope to comment on that a little bit later in the next few months.
All right, thank you very much for that. No further questions on the chat. I want to say thank you to everyone who joined us for this today. As you can see, this is a fairly complicated case, so please feel free, if you're in the room, you've got a physical press pack, you are more than welcome to consult that. Lots of dates, a detailed chronology has been put in there to assist you. If you are looking for that, please contact WMACA and we can have that press pack sent to you so that you can consult those dates as well. There are a couple of things that I'd just like to make you aware of before we close. We've consulted an expert on the extradition process, and they've presented us with a few possibilities. One of them is that given the established cooperation that South Africa and the United Kingdom enjoy, it's possible that if charges are laid locally, the countries could mutually decide whether it would be better for prosecutions to begin here or in the UK first. So they're open to negotiation on those issues. Secondly, it's possible that if any local charges are laid, for an appeal to be made to the British government to add those to the existing Scottish charge sheet to be prosecuted overseas. So it'll be interesting to see what choices are made in this case. And I'm pretty sure, Peter, this is going to teach us a lot about extradition in this country. Miranda Jordan and Luke Lamprecht are standing by. They will both be available for interviews after this media briefing. Neil Douglas is also available for online interviews, but if you would like to conduct those, please contact the WMACA team and we can set those up for you. And of course, once again, a call to anyone in South Africa who may have been drawn into the Iain Ware's story in any way, former students at school, in other circles in which he may have moved. WMACA is standing by to give you emotional and legal support should you require it. And the address on which you need to mail the organization is tanya@wamaca.org. So that's TANIA at wamaca.org. We're going to put that up on the screen in just a short while. For members of the media or anyone else who is interested, a copy of the Nikki Campbell and Neil Douglas conversation is also available. Please let us know if you would like to get hold of that. And a digital copy of the entire media briefing is also available should you require that for your purposes. Thank you very much for joining us today. We ask you to go out there and make this a headline story. Thank you and goodbye.
Sorry, may I just add something very quickly? Norman, you asked the question, the legal question about whether we had privy or something to the UK, to the Crown Office who are handling this. Who does have a lot of information is Neil, and Neil also in the team of the British survivors is also George Scott, one of the survivors who has a legal background. I'm not sure if he's an attorney or has been an acting judge in the UK, but through Neil you should be able to get a lot of the answers through him and Nikki Campbell, and perhaps speak to them after. Also, his number's available on WhatsApp. I can give that to you as well.
Because I doubt whether we'll actually, in fact, while I was listening to you, I mailed Justice Department, but I have very little faith in the government spokespeople. So it's better to go where I think maybe the UK sources would provide more information.
Yes.
And then, Norman, I just wanted to sort of make one particular point, which I think if a journalist could follow up on. This...
Oh, are you pitching a story to
for a change, Norman. So the one thing I find quite disconcerting and very concerning is the mental health professionals in this scenario. There's a level at which there was an organized thing. So I don't know how organized it was. So you had a South African psychiatrist that was approached who sent Wes to another psychiatrist in the UK who's also allegedly a South African working in a British institution. Now, if you have these programs, what is your duty in terms of where these young people are unleashed to and who they're unleashed on? So the idea that you can, as a mental health professionals, run a 3-month program, send people out, and not follow them up in any way. They come back, say they have reoffended, and you send them out again. I mean, it's the first I've heard of such a thing, and I've been doing this a very long time, and I find it quite distressing.
Well, I was going to ask earlier, I mean, you were talking, I think Miranda mentioned, the very prestigious schools, and of course nobody wants their names linked to any sexual scandal. The church, for example, we know this. Do you ever get any kind of support? I mean, I'm not talking about an article in a newspaper, but do you get people who come and say, okay, we admit that this happened under, or on our watch, here's what we can do? Does that ever happen?
I don't think
this in regard to the institutions that are implicated. Okay,
yeah,
so the institutions, how closely do they work with you once the story's out there?
So when they do hear, or we do mention their names in the media, we then get a call to quickly say they want to do a safeguarding. Bryanston High School did that when we exposed a case. Within the next week, Luke and I were sort of rushed there to sort of, give them a whole safeguarding talk and all of that. But I think it's normally like Luke says, when they are caught out, and now they would have to say something about that. But I wanted to quickly go back because what Luke was saying regarding the fact he was sent from a South African psychiatrist to a psychiatrist in Scotland into a particular hospital, which I will give you the name. And so we look crimes being committed 50 years ago, but this particular hospital, and I think it is the Royal Scottish Hospital, that psychiatric wing, the very psychiatric wing that Wes went into and was treated, is still around today. So that's sort of the next part of what we're trying to do, is actually to see if we can get any records of, sort of he was allowed to go with what? With, nothing, he wasn't helped, he wasn't, and he was able to then quickly go and do a course that led him into some of the most prestigious schools. And so we're just trying to see if any records still exist of that. But it was just very interesting, as Luke mentioned, that. So here we have a place that still exists. It feels like, oh my goodness, this happened half a century ago. Yes, it did. But the fact is, a lot of these places are still around. Where our lack of knowledge is the fact that between Western Province, Preparatory School, and St. George's, in those years, we're talking late 60s, just before he got to the UK, that is when he went to the South African psychiatrist. It has been almost impossible for Luke and I to get which South African, which psychiatric or which psychiatrist referred to him, because the school would probably have done that all. Yeah.
And I suppose in terms of finding out what the situation is like in the UK, I can get that information from Neil in terms of whether the school actually compensated or did some public health survey or something.
So it's got regarding FETS College, I think we are talking in excess of 60,000. I may even be completely wrong and say £600,000. There's been massive settlements from the school. They have acknowledged and have said all the appropriately right words now of, being so sorry that this happened and this shouldn't have happened and blah, blah, blah. But the fact is they have already made some admissions, as well as they have paid out. I'll give you that exact figure. In fact, Neil could also give you that. But I have a feeling we're talking about hundreds of thousands of pounds.
Sorry, Norman, one thing on that is that what we have found, even in the local cases, like the one that was recently reported on, the difficulty is that sometimes the structures that were there at the time don't exist. So there's, we're terribly sorry, this predates us, and, we wish the victims well, and so on. It's really quite, it's like platitude to me. There's not a real kind of investment in kind of making things different and recognizing how the institutions themselves, their structures contribute to the sort of the proliferation of these career offenders, the people who choose jobs to make a career of abusing children. That doesn't ever appear to be mentioned, because there's almost this plausible deniability, because you're totally, none of us are there anymore.
I promise you this is going to be my last question. Miranda, I think you mentioned that the extradition experts said that if a process could be started here in South Africa, they could add it to the charges or vice versa. Do we have any local survivors who have come forward? Those 42 men that you mentioned?
Yes. No, those are all the UK. I see what you're saying.
No, I mean South Africans.
Oh, South Africans. Okay. We have put an appeal out to particularly Rhonda Bosch, because Rhonda Bosch, he taught from 1980 to 2006, so we have 26 years at Rhonda Bosch School. And we believe that they have reached out to some alumni, but we must remember that this has largely not received the public attention in South Africa that this has reached in the UK. So there may be boys as back as the Western Province and St. George's and now Rhonda Bosch. What I can say, because I cannot comment on any criminal case right now, because it has been, we are banned from commenting on any criminal case that may be in the pipeline because of our Peter, our it's sub judice. Let me say,
even if there are people who have come forward, you're not allowed to say because of the sub judice rule.
Well, because we've been warned by the court that we are not allowed to. It would be I would be in contempt of court, and even though I think Peter could protect us from something about us of doing any defamation, but he wouldn't be, and I don't really want to go to jail over Iain Wares right now.
In terms of, so you say this case hasn't received the publicity that it should. So how will, if I am if I am a victim of a survivor of sexual abuse here in South Africa, and I come and tell my story, that's how others come forward. So if people reading, for example, my article on Saturday, and then there's a South African man who reads this and he thinks, but no one else here has come forward. So why should I? I'm asking in terms of that.
Yeah, okay. So if he comes forward and he makes us that we would work with him making a statement, making sure he gets to the right FCS officer and reports the statement, prior to him actually appearing in court, prior to Wares appearing in court, we could name him.
No, that's not what I'm asking.
Oh, sorry.
I am saying, so at this moment...
Peter will probably answer this better than me.
Peter, yes. At this moment, as far as we know, no South Africans have come forward.
Look, my day job is an attorney.
That's why I'm picking your legal mind, your brilliant legal mind.
But I don't know the answer.
We have to be evasive on that right now. I sincerely apologize to you, Norman. I can say to you that should anyone come forward now, they would be assisted in opening a criminal case. And until Wares pleads to the charges.
Miranda, you're giving me trouble spin.
I'm giving you such a spin. I'm so sorry.
No, but I need you to hear where I'm coming from.
Norman, let me answer it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Directly.
Yes, directly. So I've had direct inquiries by South African men to the email that was handed out from men that are in South Africa who are overseas. So in other words, they've immigrated. So the direct answer to your question is I have certainly had men that have come forward to ask me how this process is going in the South African context and how do they facilitate it, and that I can confirm unequivocally. I mean, I've actually, in one case, I've actually had a phone conversation with that person. What's interesting though, Norman, which is just another aside to it, is that there's almost a systemicness to it that's coming out. So in other words, they're saying, oh, we're not sure which teacher you're referring to because of the sub judice story, but I know about this teacher. It's not the same name. You know what I mean? So there's a systemic thing that's actually arising, but the direct answer to your question, South African men certainly have made contact with me, and the ones who have made contact with me are currently in the UK and the US and I think Canada. So I think I've had contact for men who have immigrated. No, the one I had a very long conversation with telephonically about his options because he's now overseas and the cases are here. So that's why I think the extradition option around joining cases and whatever, which is a big legal thing, is something to explore.
And equally, I've had the same inquiry. So both Luke and I have had South African men come forward once it's been known that he taught at these South African schools.
Miranda, just to add to what you were saying earlier on about the amount that Fettes College has paid out, I'm quoting from the Daily Mail here. It appears that it has paid out £400,000 to a former 67-year-old pupil who was, they say, who was beaten and sexually abused from the age of 12 by a maths teacher. And they refer to that particular pupil as as having attended the junior school and Fettes College as a day student between 1975 and 1981. Thanks, Norman. All right, so if there are no other questions, I think we can wrap up at this point. You've seen the address, tanya@wamaca.org. That is the email address you need to use should you wish to contact the WMACA team to report any information that you may have. But I want to say thank you again to all of you for attending and for making the time to listen to this. Norman, no doubt, judging from your questions, you're going to do a 6-page spread. We look forward to it. Thank you, everyone. And as I said, interview requests are welcome. Put those to the WMACA team, and we will organize those for you with pleasure. Thank you very much.